heated exchange between the Philippines and China at the 61st Munich Security Conference is making headlines abroad. It happened during the panel titled Making Waves, Maritime Tensions in the Indo-Pacific. Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo defended the Philippines' action in the South China Sea by saying that the basic issue here is that we are following international law. Wherever the Philippines undertakes any kind of activity within our exclusive economic zone as defined by UNCLOS, we feel we are within our rights. But when another country, let's say, applies its own domestic laws to certain areas within our EEZ, then it really does create the kind of tension that we have been experiencing, especially over the last 2 years. He also said that countries who signed agreements like the UNCLOS should abide by it. China is a signatory, though Manalo did not explicitly name them. His remarks didn't sit well with Chinese former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Fu Ying, who argued that the Philippines' occupation of Ayungin Shoal and Escoda Shoal violated the 2002 Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea. Fu insisted that the document's language, especially the part where it says not to make more moves, was watered down upon Manila's request. We don't have access to the clip of Fu Ying challenging Manalo, but during the Q&A, the Philippine Foreign Minister also had to field off combative questions from Chinese participants.
My question today is, according to the 1898 Treaty of Paris, the Philippines' western maritime boundary is defined by 118 degrees east longitude, and both Wang Yentao and Renai Zhao lie outside this boundary. So how can the Philippines designate these features as part of its territory in the Maritime Zones Act passed last November? If the Philippines truly considers Renai Zhao its territory, why did it choose to ground a military ship there in 1999 rather than openly deploying military forces? He did not respond to my question.
On the sidelines of the Munich conference, Secretary Manalo also met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in person for the first time. In a statement on X, Rubio said they discussed, quote, how to strengthen the U.S.-Philippine alliance to address China's destabilizing actions in the South China Sea and increase the economic prosperity of our citizens. The State Department also later said the two discussed cooperation on infrastructure, critical minerals, IT, and energy, including civil nuclear cooperation.
Let's discuss this further with our second guest tonight. We've got Don McLain Gill. He's a geopolitical analyst and a lecturer at the Department of International Studies at De La Salle University. Good evening, Don. Good to see you again. Welcome back to The Big Story.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. And like always, it's a true pleasure to talk to all of you on this.
Happy to have you on board again. Let's begin with the Munich conference, 61st Munich Security Conference. We didn't have the clips to run of that exchange between Secretary Manalo and the former Vice Foreign Minister of China, but I'm sure you've read all about it. And also, so what did you think of that? And also, what was your big takeaway from this year's Munich conference?
Right. So this is a common trick in Beijing's overarching playbook to exploit and redirect the focus in international conferences, particularly to mainstream its position, its propaganda, regardless of any factual basis, right? So when it came to the discussion points, Secretary Manalo's points were clear and undeniable, especially when citing the Philippines' rules-based actions and its position in the West Philippine Sea. However, as an expansionist power, China can't digest these statements. But unfortunately, despite the Global Times, for instance, roaring about how the Chinese representative was able to make powerful points against the Philippines, for instance, the Chinese representative would argue mainly on the preservation of the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, for instance, has probably forgotten that China has openly violated and continues to openly violate several provisions of the declaration. So let's talk a little bit about the few principles. The adherence to UNCLOS is one of the most important tenets of the declaration, and to ensure that we don't do any activities that undermine UNCLOS. 7 years after the declaration, China submitted its 9-line map to the United Nations, a clear discreditation of UNCLOS and international law, and after which China began incorporating its illegal Coast Guard laws and also recently as well to again undermine international law. What the Philippines is doing, on the other hand, is to cement our position based on international law. The Maritime Zones Law, which was signed by President Marcos Jr., reiterates that the Philippines' claims surrounding the West Philippine Sea are in line with UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award, both of which are binding. So there are several other examples which I could talk about, but perhaps we could get the discussion going as well.
Okay. Don, I'm not sure if you actually caught the back and forth between Fu Ying and Enrique Manalo, but more overall, were you shocked by the scuffle that ensued, or was this like something that you expected was actually possible?
Well, we've seen these attempts by Chinese representatives to disrupt or at least to provoke any statements that come out of the Philippines' lawful position. We've seen something similar, for instance, during President Marcos Jr.'s speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where there was a Chinese representative who sought to provoke the situation and, of course, Philippine interests. So when we look at all these past experiences that the Chinese representatives have been doing in international conferences, particularly in line with security, this really doesn't come as a shock. But really, this actually highlights how their propaganda is not really being taken seriously by several countries in the international system. And as Secretary Manalo has rightfully said, there's no other country that therefore, disagrees with the Philippines' position. And in fact, we see even our immediate neighbors in Southeast Asia, and of course, our expanded neighborhood as well, all support the Philippines' rules-based position. So I think it is clear as to who has the upper hand when it comes to the legitimacy and the objectivity of the arguments. But then again, this is to disrupt, this is to provoke, and this has been going on for a long time, especially when it comes to security conferences that really go against China's expansionist ambitions.
I take it you think that U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio meeting Secretary Manalo on the sidelines of it is a good sign. The State Department said that the two reiterated their commitment to mutual cooperation and also enhanced ties in areas like not just the maritime dispute, but to do as well with infrastructure, nuclear energy, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you've got the $500 million in additional military aid that the U.S. committed last year that's still in limbo because of the freeze on all foreign aid and grants. How are you reading this space?
Well, I'm not too worried about the freeze, and I'm not too worried either about the overarching defense cooperation between the Philippines and the United States, even under Trump 2.0. And if anything, it is in the interest of Washington to have a resilient and capable ally in the Western Pacific to forward its America First interests. And on the same time, we benefit from this level of capacity building as well. But what we need is to ensure that we have a proactive position when it comes to negotiating and directing our immediate security concerns within the overarching scheme of things when it comes to the U.S.'s strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So based on, of course, the initial Trump 1.0 declassified Indo-Pacific strategy towards the end of his term, there was a huge emphasis on the U.S.-China power competition and the need to encourage allies and partners to step forward. And from what we have seen in the past, the Philippines has been punching beyond its weight, above its weight level. And I think that this does not really send a negative message to the United States, but rather certifies that the Philippines is not only willing to do what it can and harmonize national policies with external policies when it comes to defending what is rightfully its own, but it's also willing to be an active stakeholder in the rules-based order of the Indo-Pacific. But of course, given our military and material limitations, partnerships are of great essence. And we are also diversifying. we continue to pursue proactive multi-alignment, working with countries like Canada, France, the United Kingdom, India, Japan, Australia. And it is not just us trying to ask for their help, but rather they also recognize the merits of working with a resident country that also adheres to the same interests and goals in keeping the maritime domain rules based. So it is, in fact, something where we could all benefit from one another, but this requires consistency at the policy level. And that is something that we need to ensure.
Go ahead, Pauline.
Well, Donna, since we're discussing geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, I wanted to get your thoughts on a remark that a top U.S. military commander in the Indo-Pacific, Admiral Samuel Paparo, recently made. He did say in the Honolulu Defense Forum that China, Russia, and North Korea have formed a triangle of troublemakers. He spoke about an axis of autocracy. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. How does this influence our strategic interests as well as the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, we have to say this plainly. There is no country in the international system that has the material capability and the political will other than China, to disrupt U.S. interests. So China is the only country in the Indo-Pacific with the capacity and the will to do so. And in fact, China's position also emboldens radical states such as North Korea and even Russia to be involved and to disrupt the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. And we have seen an increase of this level of, as you'd like to say, the three-way engagement in certain degrees. So it has to be clear in Washington that the most pressing threat to U.S. national security is, in fact, China. And the need to address this proactively and not to be dissuaded by other parts of the region is crucial. And this is also crucial for us. And we also, it is also in our interest. So there are what we call restrainers in the Pentagon, for instance, to talk about relocating U.S. presence, military presence away from the Middle East, away from Europe. But there's also a growing representation in the Pentagon that say that we need to relocate this and focus it more on the Indo-Pacific, to address the China challenge. Because all these challenges are interconnected, with China being the most capable of all the challengers to U.S. national interests. And most importantly, China's approach is also acutely challenging to our position in the West Philippine Sea. And you talk about infrastructure, you talk about technology and all this, it is definitely the way to go. We need to solidify our position based on different industries. And of course, one of the most important one would be the recently passed self-reliance defense posture law, which should allow us to become more functional in our ability to improve our self-reliance, at least starting from the foundational level. And this opens up a lot of new opportunities, not just with the United States, who is our sole treaty ally, but other like-minded partners as well. So I believe that there is a recognition in Washington regarding that. But if I could just quickly add, China also recognizes this, and this is why it was since the election period, China had already been increasing its maritime presence across the first island chain, Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines, for instance, to ensure that it may have leverage over its negotiations with Trump. But on the other hand, you had Secretary of State Rubio state that the future of U.S.-China relations in the Western Pacific, at least, will depend on how well China would respect the sovereignty and sovereign rights of the Philippines. So it is up to us as well to bring this on the table.
Yeah. Except U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance just gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference saying that actually Russia and China are not the enemy, but your enemies are within yourselves. He was talking to the European countries, pointing to free speech and migration as the biggest issues. These are the same themes that they campaigned on. So I hear what you're saying about Trump 1.0 and his focus on the Indo-Pacific strategy, but the difference this time is he's surrounded by J.D. Vance, he's surrounded by Elon Musk, who have vastly differing views.
Exactly.
This is not something you're worried about?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. JD Vance, exactly. He was one of the restrainers that I was talking about, to relocate U.S. military posturing away from Europe, away from the Middle East. But he did not really say much when it comes to U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific, but rather there are several opportunities, and we've seen this when he was in Paris, for instance, just a few weeks back. And he gave a lot of discussions on U.S. interests as well in the Indo-Pacific. Also, when he met the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he was there, there was a lot of positive statements coming from JD Vance. But yes, JD Vance has been quite skeptical about continuously racking up U.S. Support in Europe and in the Middle East, for that matter.
So you're not
So
worried.
yes, I agree in that
So you're not
regard.
worried that this may also carry over to the Indo-Pacific, of which we
I
are a
think
part.
I think the stakes in the Indo-Pacific are too high for the United States to sort of turn its back on against. I mean, this is where the challenge is, and the challenge is likely to pursue in the next few decades as well. And for us in the Philippines, the main objective is to prepare. And I think that there is also that resonance in Japan and even in Australia and other like-minded countries. So I do not think that the U.S. would be sort of bold enough to turn its back on the Indo-Pacific, especially at this point in time. And in fact, they had a quad discussion among the foreign ministers as one of the first major engagements of the State Department, and that's quite telling. Regarding where the Indo-Pacific fits in
Right.
Trump's overarching scheme of things. But then again, we are speculating, we are assuming based on what is currently taking place, and this opens up room for discussion in the long run.
Don, when you look though a bit more micro in the ASEAN region, pretty much I think we're the only ones who kind of see differently. Everyone is friendly with China, quote unquote. Although in Munich, the Singaporean defense minister did note the increased patrols around the South China Sea, etc. China's always been a proponent of Asians handling their own tensions, their own conflicts. What do you make of it all, right? There's America now looking inward, and we might be left with our immediate neighbors. And then where would we stand? Do you find us lacking in this regard when it comes to cohesiveness with our ASEAN neighbors?
Well, there is this thing called the Global Security Initiative that China promulgated a few years ago, and it was in full force when he visited the Middle East, and that was exactly what you were saying. Leave the Asian problems for the Asian countries, and this is more of an exclusionary policy to get the Europeans and North Americans, the U.S., out of the region, and to ensure that everything is bilateral, meaning giving China the clear upper hand given the asymmetries in power relations. But then again, if you're talking about, for instance, the US looking inward and where does this leave us? Well, for one, I do not think the US would be a complete isolationist. There may be selective areas in which it may or may not engage in when it comes to the Asian continent. So, for instance, like the ASEAN summits, etc., we won't expect much of U.S. involvement there compared to the Biden or the Obama administration. But when it comes to realpolitik, we have to remember that it was, in fact, under Trump 1.0 when they sent U.S. aircraft carriers to Vietnam for freedom of navigation, the first time since the Vietnam War. And this is also telling in terms of working with particular countries that also are able to help that position as well. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, I believe that we're keeping that open dialogue mechanism with our immediate neighbors, even with Vietnam. However, we also understand the limitations of working with ASEAN states, but we also have countries like Japan, countries like Australia, countries like India. France is an Indo-Pacific power in its own geographical position. So what I feel is that we have to continue this multi-aligned approach.
Yeah.